has been this idea of separation, which is very big in Rabin's mind and Perez's mind. The idea is to separate the population, whereas in fact, as is the case in most places in the world, there's no separation. The fact is that Jews and Arabs, Muslims, Christians, and Jews live together. They're intertwined. Not only do they live together on the ground, but their histories are intertwined. And so any idea, in my opinion, any idea that tries clinically to separate them, particularly when one group has much more power than the other, results in the kind of crazy patchwork that you get out of Oslo, where that there are two different polities, that one group has more privileges than the other. And I think a much more, true analysis both of the situation and of the reality on the ground and of the future is to devise modes of coexistence where people can live together, not as fighting, conflicting members of Jewish civilization or Muslim civilization or anything like that, but as citizens, one person, one vote. I mean, that's what South Africa was all about in the same land. I mean, I think that's a much more healthy attitude to hold for the future.
Yes.
And certainly Huntington is onto something. I said so. I mean, he's really onto this idea that in times of great change and insecurity, people of like civilization, whatever that means, he never defines it, should stick together. I mean, that's what he is saying. And my feeling is that that is a prescription for increased conflict and tension, and therefore war. What I'm proposing is much more laborious, it's much more difficult, and I think much more difficult to achieve. So in that respect, I'm not really optimistic, but I do think that there already exist examples. For example, the notion of human rights, which is now gathering a kind of universality rather, all through the world, where people are trying to talk not about, well, my culture says it's all right, that kind of thing, but rather talk about there are certain basic rights that should be guaranteed to citizens. There are areas of commonality, I believe, in scientific cooperation, weather, the environment, and things of that sort. To provide us with, in my own field, I mentioned comparative literature, the idea that people now study, young people in my department, for example, who used to come to us to study English literature are no longer interested in English literature. They're much more interested in the relations between English, African, Caribbean. In other words, English itself has acquired so many different strands and so many different literatures within it that students gravitate towards that, not towards the monolithic model where all English literature is dominated by Shakespeare and Wordsworth and Ben Jonson and Byron and so on and so forth. I'm not saying the other's bad, I'm just saying it's a different view. So I think that alternative of mixture and minimizing conflict has to be worked for, and I think that precisely it's in the university that can occur. There's something to be said for the university as a place of exploration, of opening up, of providing alternative models for interaction than conflict or domination by the powerful. And for the most part, the North American universities have succeeded if you compare them, say, to universities in other parts of the world. And I think they provide to my opinion, a very useful model for transforming the conflictual strain in a lot of cultural rhetoric into something less conflictual. Now, to conclude, I agree with you that very often it's scholars and as you said, scholastic people who originate such theories. But it's also other scholars who dispute them. And I certainly didn't want to suggest that Huntington makes no use of scholarship whatever. I say he's fatally attracted toward tags and little lines and concepts like the Clash of Civilizations, which makes them much more marketable. But I don't think that that's real scholarship. I don't think that's real, really intellectual effort. Because here we come to me, the most important point. There's no skepticism. I mean, I think it's possible, and that's where the university is also very useful, to cultivate skepticism, to ask questions against authorities, not to entrench authorities, to consolidate authorities, but to open the whole question of authority up for discussion. I think that's what the university can do. And that's why I'm much more optimistic. This American journalist, Judith Miller, whose book I reviewed recently called God Has 99 Names, I mean, it's a stunningly bad book because A, she doesn't know any of the languages, and B, she starts out with the idea that Islam is a threat. As if that's all that is, and she goes around interviewing people with her translators, and they're obviously telling her what she wants to hear. And you never turn on the television and you don't see her. She's always on there telling us about how, Hezbollah is basically, well, I heard her say about, for example, the massacre of Qana in South Lebanon in last April. She said, oh, it's terrible. She does all this kind of thing about feeling very sorry. Oh, it's terrible. The suffering is terrible. How horrible the children. But they brought them there from the Bekaa. They're not from there. They did that so that they would be killed and attract attention and show Israel. So that's what you're dealing with, sir. But one of the things that I notice is that if you look at most North American and even European universities, when the whole notion of what medieval studies are, medieval studies are basically France and Britain and Germany, include studies of the literatures and cultures of France and Britain and Germany and Italy and so on and so forth. And very little attention is paid, for example, to what in fact was a flourishing medieval civilization, that of Andalusia or elsewhere in the Islamic world. So that's a kind of marginalization. And then in the popular cliches of the time, I just read this quite recently, a book by a New Yorker reporter who was appointed to do a series of articles on the Arab and Islamic world and published it in a book, published his articles in a book called Sandcastles, a man called Milton Bjork. It's not bad. But he, for example, he makes statements, he said, Muslims have no ideas about public spaces, they don't care about the outside of their buildings, and they litter the streets and all this sort of stuff. Well, all you need to do is think about some of the great Islamic buildings and you get a sense that there is some aesthetic sense there. Or another statement he makes, which I found even more troubling, is that he says, this one of the great features, and he gets a lot of this from Lewis, one of the great features of Islamic civilization is its resolute antagonism to rationalism. Well, there the narrative, if you like, of the sciences, of medicine, of astronomy, of optics, of mathematics, etc., to which Arabs contributed, is completely, taken aside and marginalized. So this habit of reading out of the sequence these elements that disturb for contemporary reasons is, I think, quite widespread. On the other hand, I think it has also to be said that, I don't know how to introduce this exactly, but you might say in the discourse of cultural studies, generally speaking. There's very little contribution from the Arab and Islamic world. I don't understand that. That seems to me to be the case, that if you look at what are the interesting advances, the interesting journals, the interesting discussion, there are very few voices from the Arab and Islamic world that are inserted in that discussion. Is it possible to divide the world up into warring or even neutral entities, East, West, Islam, Confucianism, etc.? And I continue my own question. And is it possible to make those distinctions and divisions and humanly survive it? I don't think it is. I think that those kinds of distinctions have really fueled a great amount of, to me, wasteful, unnecessary conflict of a sort that could be much more, much better expended on cultivating the resources, on a certain kind of reconciliation and dialogue and so on, which I really genuinely believe in. So far from wanting to assert a doctrine over another doctrine, I'm really challenging the notion of cultural doctrine of that sort, no matter where it appears. Which isn't to say, to conclude, which isn't to say that one shouldn't use words like Islam or the West. They serve a useful purpose. They're a kind of shorthand. Anyway, thank you very much.